As Director of Youth Transition Programs, Troy Hall directs ABLE South Carolina's transition programs, advocates for equitable and evidence-based education and transition services, and establishes collaborative community relationships to ensure quality outcomes with transition-age consumers. Troy started employment at ABLE South Carolina in August 2018 and has built excellent relationships and partners. He is passionate about providing students with disabilities access to quality services. He graduated from the University of South Carolina with his master's in rehabilitation counseling and is a certified rehabilitation counselor. He works with the South Carolina Vocational Rehabilitation Department before joining ABLE South Carolina and believes everyone in the disability community should have equal access to opportunities and resources to exercise their agency and achieve their goals. And of course, Troy, we're so incredibly honored to have you here today. So thank you for joining us. And of course, we're very grateful to share our next presenter as well. As a equip coordinator at ABLE South Carolina, Michael Hanna works with youth with disabilities individually and in schools across the state, where he assists them in building independent living, self-advocacy, leadership, professional, and work readiness skills through peer-led groups and one-on-one mentoring. As someone living with combined type ADHD, his expertise goes beyond his professional experience. Michael graduated from Presbyterian College with a degree in psychology and with his master's in rehabilitation counseling at the University of South Carolina School of Medicine. He has a passion for working with people and firmly believes that given the right support, anyone can accomplish what they set their mind to. Michael, we're also very grateful to have you here joining us today. And collectively, Troy and Michael, we're honored to have you both presenting with us today. And at this point, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Daniel. We appreciate it. Daniel did a wonderful job with introductions. We're going to do brief introductions as well, but I did want to welcome everybody to 10 Keys to Creating Inclusive, Accessible, and Engaging Services for Youth. Michael, let's go ahead and do some quick introductions with visual descriptions. If you want to go to that next slide. Like Daniel said, my name is Troy Hall. My pronouns are he, him. I am a white male with glasses and brown hair. Today on the screen, I'm wearing a white button-down shirt, and there's an image on the PowerPoint screen of myself also wearing a white button-down shirt with some blue dots. I am the Director of Youth Transition Programs with ABLE South Carolina. So that means that all of our programs, all of the ways that we get to interact with youth in schools or through our equip clubs or through our summer programs or YLF program, all of our initiatives, I get to have a hand in that and make sure it runs smoothly. And I'm going to hand it over to Mr. Michael Hanna.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Michael Hanna. My pronouns are he, him. I'm also a white male. I've got brown hair. On the picture on the screen, I have a much shorter beard. Today, I've got a much longer beard. I wear glasses. I'm wearing a flannel shirt. On the picture, I've got a blue sweater on. I'm the equip coordinator at ABLE. And I'm going to jump us to the next slide as well. All right, ABLE South Carolina, who we are. ABLE South Carolina is a disability-led organization seeking transformational change in systems, communities, and individuals. We are consumer-controlled, community-based, cross-disability nonprofit that seeks to make South Carolina a national model of equity and inclusion for all people with disabilities. We are the state's oldest and largest federally recognized disability-led organization. More than 3/4 of our staff and over half of our board of directors are people with disabilities. We practice equity, disability justice, and representation, and true inclusion through consumer-driven independence and disability pride. We didn't just learn this. As people with disabilities, our work doesn't end when we leave the office. Disability is a part of who we are. We live this every single day. ABLE-SC's mission, we are an organization of people with disabilities leading the charge to equip people with disabilities with tools to foster pride and to direct their own lives, educate, the community to challenge stereotypes and eliminate barriers, and advocate for access, equity, and inclusion at the individual, local, state, and national level. And our vision is a South Carolina that is a national model of equity and inclusion for all people with disabilities. On this slide, we have a picture of our staff from our Advocacy Day for Access and Independence event a few years ago. We're all wearing blue themed shirts from that event, and we're standing on the steps of the State House celebrating a successful event where we had speakers come from all over the state to talk about barriers and issues that people with disabilities face every single day of their lives, and solutions that we can implement to reduce those barriers and make life more accessible for everyone, disabilities or not, in South Carolina. As you can see here, our staff is diverse. We have all different kinds of disabilities, and we've come together to offer solutions and support our community. So today's goal of the session, we're going to review some principles of universal design for learning. We're going to review the tenets of accessibility, and we want to equip educators with 10 practical tools to create dynamic, inclusive, and fun learning environments. I'm going to hand it back over to Troy to talk about the principles of universal design for learning.
Thanks, Michael. And before we get too far in, I know that not everyone in the audience is directly in education. We've got a lot of service providers, community members. And so as we're talking about these tenets and these guiding principles, keep in mind that these can apply not just to the classroom, but to program development, to individual services, really any of the work you're doing. These tips that we're going to go over should really be enhancing your services, right? If you do have questions about how this can apply directly to you, I definitely encourage you, please put it in the chat. When you're ready for questions, unmute and ask if you're comfortable. I want to make sure that this is really informative for everyone. So we're going to reserve a pretty big chunk of time towards the end of this presentation for those questions, and I'd really love to be able to speak directly to how this information can improve your individual services. So before we dive too much into these specific tips, I do want to talk about really the framework that we operate under, right? So this is this, when we talk about universal design, right? And we're not really exclusively speaking to like an architectural idea of universal design. This is really universal design for learning. So just reading off the slide, universal design for learning is a framework for designing educational curricula and environments that are accessible and effective for all learners, right? So that means that however you are creating a program, however you are structuring your classroom or coming up with a lesson or thinking about an individual service, are you creating this material in a way that's going to work for everyone? It is important to know that when we're talking about UDL, when we're talking about these principles, these best practices are based in research, right? This is based on neuroscience research. There's been plenty of studies about the effectiveness of using these principles. So this is not just sort of a common sense approach. This is not just what most people do. This really is something that's been proven to work. And we are going to post a link to a website that hosts a lot of those research articles. If you happen to be one of those people that likes to dive in and you're not interested in just trusting one source, you really want to look at where this data shows that it's effective, we'll provide that link too. So the whole idea about using universal design is that you're going to be able to create a really flexible approach to instructions or environments that's going to work for all learners. Michael, let's go to that next slide. So when we think about UDL, this is really going to be broken down into three big concepts. Right? Are we providing multiple means of engagement? Are we providing multiple means of representation? And are we providing multiple means of action and expression? Let's talk about what that actually means, because some of this can sound a little jargony. So let's go to that next slide, Michael. So when we say multiple means of engagement, we mean that we are providing different avenues for youth to be engaged, right? So this is where we're really going to make sure that learners have a motivation to learn, okay? I'm probably going to use the term youth because that's obviously mostly what I work with, but these really are principles that's going to work for any sort of age category. And again, you're also going to see the word teachers throughout just as an umbrella term, but again, this can apply to anyone providing services. So when we're thinking about, are we adhering to this guideline, these multiple means of engagement, we're thinking about, is there a way for youth to connect to this content based on their existing interests and passions, okay? Are we allowing learners to choose topics? Are we providing hands-on activities? Are we giving avenues for group work, for individual work? Big part of this is really just buy-in. Are we creating buy-in? I don't know about y'all, but when I was in traditional education, this was not always the first priority, right? Sometimes it was you're in school to learn, so you need to sit and learn. When we're thinking about how to really create effective services, effective programs, we want to make sure that youth have multiple avenues to have that buy-in, that they know why we're doing what we're doing and how it directly affects them, right? Why should they be interested in this? But we're going to talk later on through our 10 tips about how we can do that. Michael? So let's also think about the second principle, multiple means of representation, which is really just, are we presenting the same information in multiple ways to accommodate diverse learning needs? Okay, so all of you to work with, the different accommodations they may need, the different support needs they may have, are we presenting one type of information in multiple ways? So are we giving people access to different materials, different resources that are all going to sort of engage different modalities? This can really be as simple as, if something is written, saying it out loud, providing a visual aid, being able to create some sort of interactive component, really making sure we're hitting on all of these principles whenever we're presenting material. And we'll talk more in detail about what that actually looks like in practice. Michael? And then the last one, and this is a big one. If I had to say what was the toughest one to really incorporate into services, I would probably say it's this multiple means of action and expression. Okay, so are we providing learners options for being able to demonstrate their knowledge, right? So traditionally in the classroom, this might look like a written presentation, an oral response. Maybe you're allowing them to create some kind of video presentation. Maybe they're creating a multimedia project. This might start to sound kind of familiar if some of y'all are in traditional education and are thinking about unit projects or NCAP projects, right? But this actually applies to every single lesson that we're doing, individual work or group work, outside of that academic realm as well. How are we checking that youth actually have gained the knowledge and have a functional understanding of the topic that we have presented, right? How can you do that within a short time span, within a long time span, and how do you do it in a way that's giving all different types of learners ways to show you what they know, right? So this is not only important for continuing that buy-in and creating that engagement, that's also how are we going to check for progress monitoring, right? How are we actually going to check that what we're doing is effective? So this is a big one. Michael, let's go to that next slide. So the other principle that guides our services beyond UDL is making sure that we are abiding by the tenets of accessibility. So let's talk about what that is. Michael, we can go to the next slide. So When we say accessibility, and I'm going to read off the slide here, accessibility refers to the ability of people with disabilities to access and use product, services, and environments. So when we think about that in the context of education, accessibility means providing equal access to information and learning opportunities for all learners, right? So when we think about accessibility, I think sometimes we may, or especially if we're working with partners who aren't always in this field, accessibility may stop at basic architectural needs or kind of some surface level thinking. When we're thinking about how accessibility can guide our services, we're going to go into a lot more detail about what that looks like. Michael, let's go to that next slide. So, three main tenets of accessibility. That's perceivable, operable, and understandable. And even though these are kind of broken down into three big umbrella terms, this is a huge sort of concept to really, really fully wrap your head around. And obviously, a lot of us are in this field, and this is our day-to-day. But even thinking about how we can apply this to programming, it's a big challenge, right? So just to kind of give us some touch points to guide our thinking and to guide our conversation. One is, are things perceivable, right? So this means, can you actually read the text that's being presented? Are we providing captions and transcripts or videos? Are we using large and easy to read fonts? Are we providing alternative text for images? This does go beyond text too, and we're going to be talking about what that actually looks like. And a lot of these you might recognize as maybe some common accommodations that you give when requested, but we also kind of want to challenge that and flip that and just make that a part of all of our programming. The other is content operable. Okay, so a big portion of this is really thinking about it digitally. So if we're providing digital content, can people navigate through it with a keyboard? Is it going to work with a screen reader? Is navigation consistent between different resources? Is everything kind of formatted the same, or are we asking people to shift from one resource to another? And then the guiding principles of how to get from one link to another, or one page to another, does that constantly change? Are there different multimedia options? This does sort of dominate the digital realm when we're thinking about content. But this is also thinking about how we're providing content too. So are we using some sort of uniform methodology when we're presenting lessons, right? If we're using handouts, if we're putting things on the boards, if we are creating a physical space, if we have visual guides, if we have visual branding, right? Is there consistency? Is it clear? Does it make sense? And then obviously being able to physically navigate a space too, that falls into this umbrella as well. And then are things understandable? So this is different from just can we perceive it, but does it actually make sense if we can read it, if we can hear it, if we can look at that icon-based language? Does it actually create meaning for all of the people that are going to be taking advantage of our services, right? So are instructions clear? Is language simple and concise? And is content organized in a logical way? So these are kind of really big, broad concepts that are broken down in these three main tenets. But I really want us to think, when we are creating content, when we're creating programs, are we prioritizing this universal design for learning? And are we really revisiting these tenets of accessibility when we're creating activities and content and programs? Can we point to how all of these things have been upheld? So let's look into some practical tips. Let's go to that next slide, Michael.
So I know we're going to dive into specifics, Troy,
Yeah.
but I can give a really great example on how we've adjusted SMART goals recently. So SMART goals are a really wonderful way to set goals. They make everything really specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, time-based or timely, depending on which resource you're looking at. But they make goals really like attainable, right? So we look at them and they're a really great way for people to set goals, but they're very complex for a lot of individuals. And often we find that people won't follow through after you walk them through how to make a SMART goal themselves. So we developed a chart-based form that removes the SMART aspect, but you can fill out the chart. And this was a lot easier for a lot of our young people to follow, but we're still seeing a large drop off or a lot of difficulty depending on what disabilities individuals have or what grade they were in or what their reading level was. And so after getting some feedback, we've developed 2 other versions as well, based off of some of the research we've done. We've created a more visual version, which is a goal tree. So it provides a more creative, like art-based version where it's got leaves and branches and a trunk, and they can create something that's a little bit more visual and fun and creative that they can color in and have fun with while they're doing it. And we've also created a oversimplified version of the SMART goals that's a lot more accessible, called a goal ladder. And they actually create just a ladder leading up to a dream where they take one step at a time and they have to take an action before they can move up each step. And then you work with them to imply the time aspect and the achievable, like the actual realistic and achievable parts of it. So you sit with them and you like as they're planning out the action, you ask them the questions of, do you have access to those things? Is that something you can actually do as you work with each step with them? And you build out to make sure that those things are actually accessible to each group. And they can do the SMART goals no matter what level of accessibility and support that they need. And now we can do the SMART goal lessons and they can independently write out SMART goals themselves following those lessons, no matter if they're in a self-contained classroom, no matter what their disability is, no matter which supports they need. We've seen huge amounts of success all from just doing small changes to how we present that lesson.
Yeah, that's a perfect example, Michael. And actually, now that you've brought that up and I'm thinking of it, that's actually like maybe the 6th or 7th iteration of that lesson that we've gone through. So we have really found what works, but we've also done that by finding what doesn't work. And now we're at a point where if the topic is goal setting, we now have just a litany of activities to pull from that are all sort of touching on these points of accessibility and UDL in different ways. So I see in the chat, Christina, can we see an example of the goal tree? That is definitely something that we can send out. It's not built into this presentation, but Michael and I can definitely kind of talk in detail about that sort of after we run through some of these principles, because I think that's a perfect way to demonstrate kind of how we use these different ideas. Michael, let's go to that next slide. Okay, so the first key that I'm going to present to you is vivid vision. So this involves image descriptions, alt text, and video descriptions. On this slide, you'll see a blurred background of a brass key going into a keyhole with a backlight. Let's go to that next slide. So image descriptions, alt text, and video descriptions. Y'all may have noticed that Michael and I, provided visual descriptions of ourselves, and we are providing visual descriptions of everything that's on the screen. That is just a basic tenet of accessibility. So even if we are in an audience where we are fairly sure that no one has a visual disability, we never take that for 100%. And so whenever there is a visual component, one of the things that we do at Able South Carolina is we simply provide a description of it. When we provide a description, we want to be concise. We want to make sure that our language makes sense. We don't want to paint too detailed of a picture because that can be distracting at times. But once we've kind of started doing this, it became incredibly easy to just do this throughout all of our presentations, in our meetings, even when we have our social chat. So we use Teams in our office, and whenever we share GIFs or pictures, we always just include a brief description. If you follow any of our staff on Facebook, you'll also see that whenever they post something, even on their own private profiles, a lot of times they'll follow the same tenant, and when they post a picture, they'll provide a brief description of it. If someone's using a screen reader, then all of these images are going to have alt text. So they are going to get that description. But it's also good practice to say this out loud, right? Because we don't know if people are actually using a screen reader. Maybe they have a visual disability that has not been diagnosed. Maybe they have a visual disability, but they're choosing not to use a screen reader because it's more effective for them to just navigate material in a way that they've been raised. So we just provide this. That means we're describing images in detail. We're providing alt text. Everybody's using screen readers. If you are not really sure how to create alt text, if you don't know the technical process for that, if you're not sure what you're naturally inclined to provide is too much detail or not enough detail, there is a website on the screen. We can also include this in a follow-up email or as we share resources. But there are some great online resources to guide you in creating alt text. I will also say that a lot of programs, including Microsoft, has built-in alt text description. That is a great starting point, but please do not rely on that feature alone. We have seen this where a lot of our staff might become new parents or share pictures of their babies. And Microsoft is absolutely convinced that every time someone holds a newborn baby, they're holding a loaf of bread. So we make sure that we're going through and we're verifying all of the alt text descriptions and that they're accurate. And I see Sadie's asking for that link directly in the chat. We will definitely do that before the presentation is over. Thank you. So also this same thing happens with video descriptions, okay, including comprehensive video descriptions for videos to ensure accessibility for individuals with visual impairments. This you're really not going to see a lot. So if you are doing this, you're going to be an innovator. So you may be somewhat familiar with video descriptions. So that means as a video is playing, there is actually a voiceover that is explaining what's happening on the screen. A lot of times this is narrating B-roll, so narrating those sort of transitional shots just by describing what's happening. This is usually best when it's built into the actual video itself. People who have been using assistive technology, they're very familiar with this. Netflix actually does a great job of this. So a lot of their big hit shows have a, oh, great, Crystal shared that in the chat. That's wonderful. A lot of their big hit shows have a version that includes visual descriptions. So if you're not familiar with this and you're kind of curious what that looks like, I encourage you to go on Netflix, find your favorite show, go to the captioning and see if you can find the descriptive mode, and you'll kind of see how it just includes a narrator that is describing the action. It's great for people with visual disabilities. It's also great beyond visual disabilities, right? So this is also people with auditory or processing disabilities, disabilities that might affect how they manage attention, being able to look away from the screen and still hear what's going on. This is a really, really important option to include when you're sharing images and videos. Likewise, if you're not using that assistive technology, but you're just speaking as we're doing, we want to make sure that when we're presenting an image, we are sort of painting that vivid picture for all learners, okay? It's going to enhance that engagement. It's going to ensure comprehension. And then making sure that subtitles are on as well. We actually had an interesting chat before this presentation started about how subtitles are going to be useful for more than just people with auditory disabilities. It can also be for processing, it can also be for attention. Now, I will say that sometimes this is a learning edge. There are some individuals, especially young people who aren't used to this technology, who could see it as distracting. We have seen that by sort of exposing them to things like visual descriptions, to these captionings, eventually they do become used to it, where it does not pull away from their attention. But that is something to think about if you're working with a specific classroom or specific group of individuals. Michael? Okay. The next key that I want to present to y'all is keeping things plain and simple. So we have that same image of a key in the background. This is using clear language for smooth sailing. So, plain language is actually the legal standard in most parts of the world. In America, it is not, but it is something that we are striving towards. So when I am talking about plain language, I'm not just talking about that in sort of common sense terms. Plain language is actually a specific guidelines to describe really any sort of text. Okay, so there's a resource on the screen, plainlanguage.gov. There are also a lot of great tools that can actually translate our text into plain language. This really means avoiding jargon, avoiding that sort of complex language. If we're using acronyms and we are explaining these acronyms every single time, I'm sure all of us have been in a situation where we have talked to someone who's from a different field and they get really excited and they try and explain something and they're dropping names and words and acronyms that we've never heard. And maybe you're like me and you kind of smile and nod and hope that they rephrase it. Or maybe you've fallen into this trap yourself and you get really excited and you're trying to share something from your field. And you've kind of had to rephrase things in a way that's going to be accessible to people who might not have that specific language. One thing I want to emphasize when we're talking about plain language, and really anytime you hear us using the phrase simple or simplifying, we're not talking about simplifying things in the context of stripping features away, right? So we are not taking a complicated topic and just pulling out one key aspect to talk about, right? We are going to talk about every single part of a process, but we're going to rephrase every single part. So when you see plain language, a lot of us might assume that means that there's less reading or less text. But a lot of times, if we're translating a source into plain language, it can end up being longer because we are taking more time to explain concepts. So we're breaking down complex concepts into simpler terms to make sure that all students, all learners have comprehension. We're providing explanations. We're providing examples to clarify things. I will say that a lot of times when we are working through the idea of breaking down a concept into smaller parts to understand, we might be tempted to use things like analogies or metaphors in some way, and that is going to be beneficial to some learners. But I also want to stress that that's not going to be accessible to a lot of learners, right? A lot of people with disabilities, they might not be able to understand things easier when we're putting in these terms. In fact, one of our coworkers who has since moved on to another field, but she kind of left us with a phrase that we use all the time. And that is, if they did not understand something, they would just say, "Can you say the same thing again in a different way?" Right? And they would continue to ask that until they understood what we were saying. So you'll probably do a lot of this naturally, but I do want to let you know that there are actually guidelines in how to do this, right? Like I said, a lot of the rest of the world actually uses plain language as a standard. This is a way to kind of get around legalese, which I just mean that sort of dense legal language that you might find in a business contract, or whenever you scroll down to the bottom of a page and you click I agree, but you definitely did not read those terms because they didn't make sense, right? So plain language is an effort to get away from that complex language and shift it into something that everyone can understand, regardless of what their knowledge base is. Like,
Yeah, I just wanted to add to this. The Equip program we have at Able is a peer-to-peer mentoring program for youth with disabilities. So we hire youth with disabilities to be peer mentors. And our requirement with plain language has been an awesome opportunity for me to realize that I don't understand a lot of things as well as I thought I did. So a lot of times I'll try and explain a concept and they will let me know that I've just confused them, and I'll try and explain it in plain language and realize that I don't have the words to do that. And I'll have to work and look that up and work with them to find that language. And I've realized that all I've done is memorize the more complex language to say those things and apply that idea, but I didn't fully understand the concept. And by learning how to explain it in plain language, I actually understand the core of that idea much, much better than I ever would have if I hadn't had to do that to start with. And so by writing things in plain language and explaining things in plain language, you understand the core concepts of what you're doing much better than you would just by sticking with the complex terms and the complex language for like without having done that before. Troy mentioned there's some tools out there. I can add some links at the end of the presentation for them, but some of the ones that we're referring to, this is a great place to use some of those newer AI tools as you're getting used to using plain language. You do need to check them. It's not really AI, right? We all know it's a large language model, but the free version of ChatGPT can help. You can put in your thought and ask it to rewrite it at a, I believe, 5th grade level is what we aim for. I usually give it a lower grade level because what it thinks a 5th grade level isn't actually a 5th grade level. And then one that I like even better is something called Goblin Tools. It's a free tool that's out there. It has something on it called a formalizer. It can break things down into bullet points, but one of the things they have is just an option where you can say easier to read, and you choose like the spiciness level of number of peppers, which is how much you want it to adjust what you've written in it. And it can help paraphrase or adjust things by a bunch of different categories. And one of them is easier to read, which is just putting something into plainer language. And you choose how much you want it to adjust it, and it does a really good job. It's an open source project, and it works really well. So I'll add those links at the end when I'm done sharing my screen. And those are a great place to do it. Just make sure you double check that it actually is explaining what your intention was. You may have to do some editing before you send it out.
yeah, thank you, Michael. And then I'll just have one more caveat. These tools that we use, they're incredibly helpful. I will say one of the things we're still kind of waiting on and even trying to push on in some ways is accessible AI tools. So the links that are going to be shared, we do just want to add a caveat that they're not always fully compatible with screen readers. They don't meet the highest standards for accessibility. But if you can use them and navigate them, they're great tools to have.
Yeah, so accessibility and then privacy as well. So don't put any private patient or client or student information into them. You can put concepts or non-private information into them, but anything you put into them, they are being developed and will be added into a cloud database. So general information is fine, but private information should be treated as if it's being put into Google or out into the internet.
If you couldn't tell, Michael and I are also exploring some technical assistance and training for how people can use AI tools. But let's move on to that next point. Move and groove kinesthetic activities that can spark learning. Let's go to that next slide. So, kinesthetic activities that spark learning. This is just how are we incorporating activities that are going to engage students physically and mentally, right? So what kind of movement-based opportunities can you offer in the classroom as you're providing services? What does that look like? And when we say movement, that doesn't mean running from one side of the room to the other. It absolutely can, and we have definitely had plenty of activities where we've done that, but that's also going to depend on the specific population of students that you're working with. So this can be something as simple as multiple choice options. Answer number 1, if you think it's 1, go to the back left corner. If you think it's 2, go to the back right corner. This can be pressing a buzzer to answer a question, but maybe you've moved the buzzer to one side of the room or the other, or one part of the desk or the other. We've done this where people are selecting answers by selecting appropriately colored Post-it notes from different wall stations to choose their answer, right? This can also be just as simple as when you're setting up a workstation, you're setting it up in a different part of the room. I am a big fan of making sure that all of our activities have some sort of kinesthetic component, but that does not mean it's always going to look like physically moving your entire body from one part of a room to another, right? Because we work with a lot of youth and a lot of adults, and we have a lot of coworkers who might have limited mobility and dexterity, right? And we do not want to create an activity where everyone gets to do something except for one person, okay? So that means we're going to adjust according to the group that we're working with, right? Even if we prepared an activity that's entirely based on movement and we come in and we find that students might not be able to do that, that means we are going to pivot. We're going to move to our backup plan where we're still going to include some sort of kinesthetic activity, excuse me, but it might be an adjusted version of what we're doing. So, for example, we might have to move into a hallway. There's going to be more room, so someone who uses a power chair can move back and forth and indicate if they're choosing answer 1 or 2. This could be moving these kinesthetic answer stations instead of sides of the room. Then they just become different parts of a desk or different desks that are within arm's reach, right? And this can be also done as part of content. This can also be simply manipulating physical pieces of paper around on your desk. So we recently had an activity where people are looking at possible answers to a question, right? They're actually solving some HR scenarios that are based around accessibility and inclusion, right? And then they're physically ranking answers by physically moving slips of paper up and down on a sheet, and then throwing away the answers that they don't like, right? So instead of writing, instead of clicking, you might have thought this could be a virtual lesson. If we're in person, how can we create this sort of kinesthetic movement? We can even kind of simulate this in some virtual scenarios. So we use a lot of software that allows for drag and drop options. This is a little tough finding accessible software that does that, but we have found ways to do this just even in Google. And sometimes this is even just if there's limited technology and we're doing a virtual lesson, like say we are projected onto a screen, this might not allow for each individual youth to physically move things, but they can at least dictate how we as the facilitators should move things around the screen, okay? So making sure that we have some sort of kinesthetic element in all of our lessons really is paramount. This is going to be key to a lot of the learners that we work with. Also, it just keeps our own presentations more exciting and innovative, right? If you are not having fun when you're teaching, if you're not having fun when you're facilitating a program, then your audience isn't either. Michael?
Absolutely. It's just trying to switch up what we do all the time when we're in school or learning situations, which is just sitting there the entire time, right? And listening. My favorite icebreaker virtually that I've ever done, which was at-home scavenger hunt. So we gave them a list of items and they had to find 5 of the 15 or something around their house. And so all of the youth that were in my group, including the ones who originally had their cameras off, had to show me the items. Suddenly I heard scurrying, and a couple minutes later, they all came back and every camera was on. And they were all showing me staplers and note cards and magnets from their fridge. And most of them had their dogs and cats. And all the lessons I had during COVID, where everyone's cameras are off, I suddenly could see everyone's face with a giant smile. So just coming up with creative ways to get moving and everyone engaged is super, super fun. And you're going to have a lot more engagement, a lot more learning when we do it in a new way that we're not usually doing things.
Yeah, well said. Keeping an eye on time, we are going to scoot our pace just a little bit because we have some really great content. So, showing your style, how can we provide those multiple assignment options for every learner? Let's go to that next slide. And then that has the same image of the key, excuse me. So, how can we create a variety of assignment options for you to choose from? So some traditional models of this are, do you want to do a presentation? Do you want to write an essay? Or do you want to create an art-based project, right? The thing to keep in mind when we are offering alternatives for youth to kind of show what they've learned is, are they showing that they can remember the content? If we're at this stage, are they showing that they understand the content, right? So are they rephrasing it? Are they showing some sort of application? Or are they showing some sort of synthesis, excuse me? Are they showing a way that they have actually used this content, or they know that how they can use this content to create new knowledge or link it to existing content, okay? We want to make sure that everyone is shooting for the same thing when we're thinking about these levels of understanding. So whatever your assignment is, we don't want to rank it so much as to say the essay is the most complicated way to do it, presentation is the second most complicated, and then the easy way is the art project, right? We want to make sure that people are, if the object of the lesson is that they're showing they can remember a specific piece of content, then we want to see that across all 3 platforms. If the objective of the content is to show synthesis, to show how they are going to use this knowledge to create new knowledge or link it to existing knowledge, we want to see that across all of these options, okay? And also, don't discount a modality just because you think it's like the easy one, or maybe it's not traditionally used. It may be that only one student chooses to show their knowledge in that specific way. But if one student's choosing to do it, then that is a win, and that is worth building in an avenue for them to present. Obviously, if you are in traditional education, or if you're working with traditional education and you are trying to build a specific skill, like essay writing, you cannot give them the option to do an art project instead, right? So this does have its limits if you are testing a specific skill. You also want to make sure that if you are giving these options, that you are giving guidelines for each of these options, okay? So we want to make sure that students know exactly what is expected of them, and if this is being graded in a specific way, that we are providing the grading criteria for each assignment option, okay? One thing that we prioritize in our curriculum, because we facilitate a lot of pre-employment transition services across the state of South Carolina. We go into high schools and we do a lot of teaching thanks to our partners at VR. We always say that our objectives and our standards of learning, those are static in every single lesson, right? So if we are going in to teach a lesson on conflict management, the objective of that lesson does not change, unless there are specific modifications to consider. But the objectives should not change. It's the way we present content, the way that we give avenues to have students engage. That's what's going to change. But we want to make sure that everyone is getting exposure to the same objective, right? Yes, and I love that comment. Having students act something out, absolutely. And we're bringing in some kinesthetic elements, yes. And I will say that's a perfect example too, because if you gave me the option of writing a 15-page essay or getting up in front of a classroom and acting something out, I will give you a 15, 30, 100-page essay. Please don't make me get up in front of the room and do things. But we want to give options to all of our students, and a lot of our students absolutely love the ability to do that, especially if they see it modeled and they see maybe other students doing that. That's going to be a big hit. So excellent point. Let's go to that next slide, Michael. And then probably our favorite thing, in fact, we're going to have to be careful because this could be a whole session in and of itself, but gamifying learning. That falls under this same umbrella, right? So can we take content that might be, we'll say stale, right? Can we take a paper quiz and now turn this into scaffolded rounds of trivia questions, right? That people can kinesthetically buzz and answer into, right? Can we award people specific levels, right? Can we create an activity that has an edge of competition? Or if you've got some students who competition is not their motivator, can we create a collaborative project, right? Is there going to be a way to offer instant feedback or a score of some kind when we are presenting content or grading content? I will say we do need to be careful with the idea of scores too. Sometimes that feedback is a lot better because scores can be very discouraging, just like competition can be very discouraging for some students. The same thing that's going to motivate some students might not motivate others. So we want to make sure that we are structuring activities in a way that's going to be accessible and engaging for everyone, right? Okay, Michael. Colors pop and icons rock. So talking about color contrast and relevant visual iconography. Let's go to that next slide. Okay. So let's talk about color contrast for a moment. If you look at the grid on screen, you will see 4 squares. The top left square says bad in purple text against a purple background. The top right square has a gray background with black font that says good. The bottom left square has a green background with yellow text that says bad, and the bottom right red square with red text that says bad. So that is just an illustration to show that we really need to be careful about the ideas of color contrast. Okay, so making sure that color contrast and visuals are very readable. This is especially important for individuals with visual disabilities or color blindness. If you are not sure if there is appropriate color contrast, there are some built-in tools to Microsoft and Google, but there's also just contrast checkers online. So we linked colors.co/contrast checker, but there are lots of contrast checkers online. Let's go to that next slide, Michael.
I just want to add too, that isn't a point on here with color contrast. I get migraines. It's one of my disabilities. And if your color contrast is in one of these bad categories, when I put it in dark mode, it will be wildly unreadable and still really bad for my migraines. But if it's in the good category, I should be able to read it when I put it in dark mode as well.
Awesome. And then we also just want to talk about using iconography, right? So a lot of times we're going to be working with youth. Green characters are the easiest read. Sometimes that can be the case. Really, any colors that are going to work with that color contrast checker, that's going to work really well. When we're talking about using icons, because we're probably going to be working with students who might not read we might not have access to material that's on an appropriate reading level, right? And sometimes we're not here to build up those reading skills. We're here to build up practical skills or pre-ed skills that aren't always tied to reading. So we might be using icons. I'm a big fan of just including icons throughout. Sometimes pictures can be really complex to make sure they're accessible. So I use icons. We use the nounproject.org. That's just a way for us to pull different icons. An important thing about icons is making sure that the icons we use are consistent throughout all our material. So if we are choosing an icon, we are sticking with it through all of our material. And making sure that when we are using an icon that it's going to be relevant. I'm going to hazard a guess that a lot of us on this call, or excuse me, on this webinar can probably recognize all of the images on the screen as types of phones. But if I was to go into a classroom today and show them this image, they would not be able to recognize some of these phones. So the image on the screen has a white background. It has 4 icons on it, one with a handheld receiver with some lines coming out of it to show noise, one of a simple cell phone, another icon of actually a landline phone with a base, and then just another handheld receiver, right? So I included this to show that we want to make sure if we're using icons, it's going to be something that our audience understands. Let's go to that next slide, Michael. Multi-format mastery, presenting content in multiple formats. We touched on some of this. Let's go to that next slide. So we want to make sure that if we're presenting content, we're using a variety of formats, right? So just like I am speaking right now and you can see this written text, we also want to include maybe access to audio files that people can access individually, some video components, and some interactive materials that are all going to cover the same content. That's really important that we're covering the same content in multiple ways. This is going to cater to multiple intelligences. I also always kind of drop this little hint that we're moving away from this myth of learning styles, of people learn by seeing or they learn just by hearing, right? This may come into play with specific disabilities, but really studies show that we don't really have preferred, or there is no science to back the idea of learning styles through visual, through audio, things like that. People learn best when they get access to all of these styles, right? And then offering supplemental resources to support comprehension is always going to be helpful. So providing individual handouts that are covering the exact content that you said, pointing people to resources like websites that's going to cover the same content, allowing people to explore it in different ways. Let's move to that next slide too. Easy access, so ensuring physical accessibility in the classroom. So, is the space you're in, which might not be a classroom, maybe it's your office, maybe it's wherever you go to host activities, is that a physically accessible space? So, are seating arrangements laid out in a way so that people who use different mobility devices can navigate to get to all aspects of the room? Or have you just cleared a path where the one student who uses a power chair gets to sit in one spot and maybe they can get in and out the door and that's it, right? We want to make sure that if we have the ability to, because sometimes we're not in spaces that we can control, but if we have the ability to, have we created a physically accessible space for everyone? Some other things that we build into the physical accessibility of spaces is making sure that we have safe spaces for decompression. So sometimes that can just be a comfy chair in a corner. Sometimes that can be an office across the hall. If we are hosting a big gala or fundraiser, we always have a quiet room. We have our youth leadership forum coming up. And while we have some really great video games and board games and field activities, we also have a separate sort of soundproof quiet room that's a supervised space where youth can go to. We also want to make sure that if there is accessible technology, it's in a place where students can access that independently, right? So if someone uses a communication device, if someone uses a magnifier, if someone uses a speech-to-text device, is that something that they have to go to you and ask for, or is it something that they can reach and change out as needed independently, okay? If you have access to something like adjustable desks or ramps, that's wonderful. It's definitely always something to strive for. I also understand that a lot of times when we create these programs, we don't get to pick the space, right? We're given a space. So we just want to exercise as much control over organizing this space as possible. And also, if we're using visuals, if we're using decorations in the classroom, are those accessible, right? Are we following those rules of color contrast? Is iconography consistent throughout, right? Have we provided image descriptions on images that are decorative? Okay. Let's go.
It's also, I was just going to add one thing. If you do have to adjust something to make it more accessible when someone's there for like physical accessibility, uh, making it not a big deal to make that adjustment and just making the adjustment. If someone's apologizing for you having to do that, reminding them that like it's not a big deal, that it should have been set up that way to begin with. They don't need to apologize, I think is important. And then making it a priority to have it set up for them when they come the next time. So ideally for it to be permanently set up that way for anyone who could need it in the future, but absolutely set up to be accessible every time they're going to be before they get there in the future as well.
Yeah, perfectly said. Michael's a great person to kind of navigate that conversation with. He's got a great way of sort of explaining to partners why we do things. And undoubtedly, every time we go to a new space and we introduce them to the idea of accessibility features, when we come back, they've built it in and they've used it in our absence for other people. We've also seen where teachers have set up their classroom differently, and then students who didn't normally access some of these features because they've seen communication boards, because they've seen magnifiers, or because they've seen someone else use a sit-stand desk, they start to use it, and then they see increased productivity, right? Or increased ease of access. Let's go to that next point. Formatting harmony, consistent formatting for smooth navigation. This one I feel like is pretty easy to overlook. So we want to make sure that if we're creating content, if we are introducing content, is it consistently formatted, right? Are we using the same sort of font styles, the same sort of layout? Are we using headings? If we're creating resources in places like Google or Microsoft, are we using those features of even just using the title feature and the subheading feature, right? The reason that we want to use these built-in features and the reason that we want to make sure that things are consistently formatted is one, it's going to work better for screen readers. It's going to work better for people who use digital assistive technology to be able to navigate resources, right? If we don't use features like this is the title, this is the heading, then it's not going to translate correctly when people try and use this assistive technology. It also ensures that people with different disabilities, if they're trying to navigate a handout, right, that they're not going to get lost in different wording, that they're not going to get distracted by too many different styles. Everything is looking very consistent, right? And there is a way to do this that it doesn't look quote unquote boring. But we do want to ensure consistency, making sure that we're using clear organization and structure. We're using bullet points where possible. We're not using blocks of text. We're using heading and spacing. We want to make sure things are incredibly readable. And honestly, we've applied this to everything, to emails that we send out to partners, even sometimes to proposals that we send out, our newsletters, our progress monitoring for grants, right? Using this in conjunction with plain language, we're able to create much more readable text that's still covering all of the quote unquote complex points we want in a way that's more organized. And honestly, y'all, even when we're not working with students, sharing this with coworkers, with bosses, with partners, we find that people just read things more. I'm sure we have all gotten these massive emails that have blocks of text. We just sort of sigh and we file it away for later, right? But if we can utilize consistent formatting, if we can utilize bullet points, if we can utilize, again, that plain language, that's going to improve readability. This also goes to classroom visuals and handouts. Let's go to that next slide. IEP for all, implementing IEP accommodations for everyone. This really is kind of as simple as it sounds, right? When we are considering accommodations, let's think about those potential benefits for all students, not just for students with the documented disability, right? So extended time for assignments, preferential seating, um, these things that you might offer an individual student as part of their IEP can really benefit a lot of your classroom, and it does not take away from the learning of other students, right? Um, and a lot of time when students sort of get access to some of these accommodations, they realize how beneficial it is to their own individual learning, and maybe it becomes something that they want to advocate for on their own IEP, right? So you want to be able to work with students to identify and implement these accommodations that are going to sort of enhance that learning experience. We've linked understood.org as a great way to sort of explore IEPs and accommodations on IEPs. But then we've also linked askjan.org. And Michael, I know you love Ask Jan, so I'm going to ask you to speak about it, but just in like your 90-second pitch.
Yeah, so Ask Jan is a wonderful website. It's put together by a group of lawyers, and it is a resource that explains a whole bunch of different disabilities very simply. And it's designed to give resources on how to provide accommodations or understand accommodations to employers and for employees to be able to have those conversations in the workplace. It also translates really, really well if you want to figure out how to talk about it outside of the workplace, whether that's at school or just to people in your life. It's a really good resource to start with in figuring out accommodations. It's best for the workplace, but you can use it anywhere.
Yeah, wonderful. All right, let's go to the next point. This is our last sort of key to accessibility. And not that I have favorites, but this one might be my favorite. So this is cultivating an anti-ableist classroom. And we're using the term classroom, but I'll remind you, this can be programming, this can even be office environment. This can really apply to any sort of program that you are helping with. Let's go to that next slide. Okay, cultivating an anti-ableist classroom. So integrating disability rights and history into curriculums and able to foster understanding and empathy for all people with disabilities. Notice that I said empathy, not sympathy. I don't know about y'all, but when I was in school, I didn't learn anything about disability rights, disability history. The idea of disability pride was incredibly foreign. I am a person with a disability, but I didn't come into that identity until much later in life. So I had a quote unquote traditional sort of high school experience and college experience. And as I sort of have gotten into this field, as I've started working with agencies like Folk Rehab and Able South Carolina and all of our partners, it's been a real professional development point for me to learn about disability history. And I gotta say, it is such a shame that this is not sort of part of common knowledge, right? So finding ways to celebrate diversity and promote disability pride by highlighting the strengths and contributions of individuals with disabilities. So we may all know who Judy Human is, but there's probably a lot of high school students who don't, right? We may know who Justin Dart is, but there's probably a lot of youth who don't, right? We may know who Alice Wong is, right? But other people don't. And so being able to find ways to think about these monumental figures in disability rights history, these incredible moments in disability history, like the 504 sit-in or the protest through the Gang of 19, or even the more recent ADAPT protest, right, to fight for healthcare coverage. Talking about these big moments, talking about how people with disabilities have really created their own history and have been these massive advocates who have frankly reshaped the world. Are we finding ways to talk about that in our programs, right? As we talk about these things, you find that you create a supportive and inclusive environment, right? So if you're in the classroom, this is going to create that kind of learning community where youth really start to challenge some very intrinsic ableist ideas. We want to create an environment where youth are valued, where they're respected, where they do not feel discriminated against, and where they can point out and fight against ableism, right? Making your space accessible, creating engagement, making sure that your program is a place where people with whatever type of disability they have can go, they can create community, and they can effectively learn. That's us fighting against ableism, right? Let's go to that next slide. So, a very quick recap. Why should we do this? We see improved performance, increased motivation, improved understanding of content. It creates a learning community, right? Students are engaged, they see improved relationships with peers and their educators. And it reaches all students, right? Even if you don't have a disability, ESL students, students who have disabilities that are undiagnosed, you see better performance. Let's keep going. So we talked about image descriptions, alt text, and video descriptions. We talked about using plain language. We talked about implementing kinesthetic activities as much as you can. We talked about providing multiple assignment options for all learners, being mindful of color contrast and using relevant visual iconography. Let's keep going. We talked about being able to present content in multiple forms. Talked about ensuring a physically accessible classroom, using consistent formatting in all of our content, sharing IEP accommodations with all learners, and then cultivating that anti-ableist space. Right? These are the keys to creating engaging and accessible programs. Let's keep going. Some things I always like to leave with. You're not going to be perfect at this. We are literally experts at accessibility, and we still miss things, right? You're not going to be able to do every single one of these all the time with every program. It is impossible. This is just what we strive for. This process takes time up front, but you see the results in the back end. So be realistic with yourself about how much time you really have to create things, right? If you can dedicate more time to really creating content that follows all these keys, you are going to see the benefit later on. It's going to cut down on work later on. Using universal design and accessibility is how we push for equity and access. So I like to say this is not just about effective education. This really is a matter of justice. Let's keep going. I want to leave you with this quick quote from Nick Tillman. Accessibility is not extra steps. It is the steps that we missed. So, I believe we have our contact information. Is that right? Yeah, we're going to keep our contact information up on the screen, but I hope I left some time for questions. Daniel, I don't know if we got any in the chat.
Well, just first and foremost, both Troy and Michael, this was an incredible presentation and so relevant and so very much needed. So thank you both so much for such great content and such an informative presentation. So thank you too for that.
Thank you so much.
So one question that it looks like just popped up in the chat box. It says, I am a benefits planner who assists individuals with SSA benefits and explaining work incentives. The plain language interests me. Is this something you see would be beneficial to use for this purpose and for report writing?
Yeah, absolutely, Michael. I'll let you chime in, but I'll say that a lot of navigating these benefits is a very complicated process, right? You probably have all of this knowledge in your head, and you probably have a really good way to explain this to some of the people you work with. But if you are trying to create some plain language resources that you can give out, that's going to be really, really beneficial. It can be incredibly hard to explain, right? So maybe using some of these AI tools, maybe just taking some time, even though I know time is a precious resource, and creating a plain language sort of bulleted handout with some really clear headings, including some iconography, that can really help break down these very complex topics into ways that can be understood. I can already tell you that if you try and take that on, that's going to be, you're not going to create a one pager. You're going to create a little book. But if the information is accessible, people are going to be able to navigate through that resource a lot better than maybe the traditional resources that you're giving, or just kind of having a lengthy conversation. Michael?
Yeah, so Troy, you said you were gonna let me make a comment, but you said all the things I was gonna say. If you're gonna use some of the AI tools as a benefits planner, I think the only thing to be careful of is that the private information you put into AI tools is not private. So make sure you anonymize any information you're putting in there, or just put general information. So if you're making a guide, might be a great thing that you could make in using AI tools, and then use some of the ways that it adjusts the language when you're making specific things for individuals. So adjusting it to the individual, or making like a tool that you can just plug individual information into later.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, Troy.
No, I'll make this quick. I would say if you are, maybe you're not really at the point where you're comfortable using those AI tools, or that's not your style, it's totally fine. I would also say grabbing a coworker, or even if you have a relation, family member, or a spouse, and kind of piloting how you would explain things, and writing them down, and being patient with yourself as you're creating these sort of resources, but using an audience who is not someone who's already familiar with this. That's going to be a great way to test the accessibility of resources you create.
You too. It looks like another question popped up in terms of, do you have any advice about advocating for accessibility of aspects of campus programming that are not necessarily required for any course taken by students with disabilities?
Yes, absolutely. And I wish we had some of our youth on this webinar, because they are the ones who have really advocated for that, right? I can go ahead and tell you that just because something is not required per se, it still needs to be accessible, right? Is there, before I get too much into a soapbox, is there a specific feature that's not accessible that we're trying to change?
Yes, please feel free to unmute yourself if you may like to respond for further clarification.
Okay, Chris Reed's saying that this is often the biggest issue with getting sign language interpreters for campus events, when when we don't have a specific request from a specific enrolled student, for example.
Yeah, so I will say the sign language piece can be a little difficult just because of the cost associated with that. So generally, it does have to be requested. There are some, I can't really advocate too much for them because they're such in their infancy. There are some AI tools to sort of create sign language from captions. I would just really encourage to make sure that they can say with absolute certainty that there's no one who's going to benefit from this service, and making sure that requesting ASL interpreters is a really easy process that everyone on campus knows about, right? Because then you run into that sort of catch-22 where people aren't going to go because there isn't an interpreter, and because there isn't an interpreter, no one goes. So really kind of educating the campus public that is a feature. And if you're interested, we can also talk about that as well if you wanted to use our contact information.
Yeah, I was just to echo Troy, if you have students who need an interpreter, that can give you a statement as well that they have not attended things because there weren't interpreters. I think that's a really great place to start as well, because that means that it wasn't accessible to them. And that may lead to like that easier request because depending on the barrier to access, so how difficult it is to request, it should be a simple process and really clear process on how to request one. Or the simplest option is to have an interpreter at each event, but that also can be very expensive. So if it's a very simple and easy process for them, we can make that work as well.
Thank you both. So we do have another question. It says, I was just at a training by our school's IT department who recommended Rave by WebAIM, which interfaces on top of a website to show you what are the issues for someone with a disability that they may face, especially as we update some of our own websites for accessibility. By any chance, have you heard of this or used this before?
So Michael, if you've heard of this, let me know. I'll say that I have not specifically heard of this tool. I will say that best practices are usually, there are some tools that are definitely going to assist, but contacting an expert in accessibility and kind of having them do a review is really going to be best practice. So your local Center for Independent Living can absolutely do that. There are suites of tools online. Since we're talking about this point, there are suites of tools online that say that, oh, you can just download this and it'll make things accessible, or it'll create an overlay that's accessible. Ironically, overlays are generally not accessible. So I really applaud you for kind of revisiting your website and looking at accessibility from the top down, or excuse me, from the bottom up. I can't speak to confidence with that specific tool, but my personal 2 cents would be to see if you can connect with an accessibility expert. And again, if you wanted to reach out to us, we'd be more than happy to talk about that.
Yeah. So WebAIM makes a lot of really great accessibility tools. But as Troy said, best practice is even using their accessibility tools to have someone with a disability that it's checking for to double check. Even if something is saying that a screen reader can use it or that it is accessible, doesn't mean 100% that it's going to be accessible just because the tool said it is. We run into issues where the accessibility tool said it was 100% accessible, and then someone using a screen reader or someone using different accessibility devices can't actually access that site. So it just depends. I mean, it met the minimum standards for the tool, but the reading order was wrong. And you have to adjust that at the website level. And so it just didn't make any logical sense when you're going through the website. So it's a really great start. It'll be better than websites that didn't use the tool. But you also want to make sure you're checking it with someone who daily drives a screen reader and uses other accessibility tools as well. So just having them look over it and tell you if they ran into any issues would be that extra step.
Well, thank you both. So, oh, sorry, Troy, I don't know if you were going to add something.
Just gonna add, like we talked about, bulleting, formatting, plain language. A lot of tools are not gonna check for that too. So having that human element check for those things can be really helpful.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. And it looks like we do have another question. Is there a way to test online forms to ensure that a screen reader program can read it?
Another great question. Troy, do you want to take this first, or do you mind?
Go for
it. So the best way to test it is to use a screen reader. So your computer should have one built in, whether you're using a Windows or a Mac. They should have a narrator. I believe it's also called a narrator, or Siri will read it. But one thing to keep in mind is that every screen reader works a little bit differently. So they have slightly different features. So just because one computer can read everything, it might be slightly different depending on what computer they're using. So you want to make sure that it reads absolutely everything and can go through the entire function. And then you also want to include, when you send out the form, a link for them to reach out to you if they run into any issues. That way you can provide a service where they can give you answers and you can read them out to support them. And then if you have the funds or the access, or you have someone on your team who can check it from multiple different resources, so multiple different screen readers, or you have an accessibility team, having them check it would be absolute best practice that you could possibly do.
Thank you. And just one other question that's popped up as well is, what, if any, are common misconceptions that you both have encountered either by colleagues, community partners, or other organizations as it relates to accessibility? And how have you helped try to provide further education or combat those misperceptions about accessibility?
Michael, I'll jump in with a short version, and then you chime in with whatever I miss. So one thing is that people kind of view accessibility as an afterthought, or it's something that can be added on, when in reality, accessibility features need to be thought of at the conception, right? So we want to make sure that we're thinking about these as we're developing contents and forms and tools. There's also the legal ramifications, right? So not only is it best practices that things are accessible, but if you're creating public resources or you're in public spaces, we want to make sure that these things are accessible. Most of the time, we found that if people are not making something accessible, it is because they didn't know they were supposed to, or they don't know how to do it, or they assumed, you know, because the color contrast was right, that they met all the standards, right? Most of the time, accessibility mistakes are completely out of ignorance. And for most of the time, when we work with partners and we explain the importance of it, or better yet, when we're talking with partners and we have someone who uses a screen reader to actually be there and be a part of that conversation, that's when it really starts to hit home that accessibility is a big priority. Michael, I miss anything?
Just a couple small ones. Most accessibility, a lot of people think accessibility options are expensive. 90 to 95% of them are completely free. A lot of them are just checking accessibility and making small adjustments or rearranging rooms. We encounter a lot of that's never been done before, so we can't do it. I'm sure y'all have encountered that before. Often it's just doing it for the first time. And then accessibility needs to be the expectation, right? So setting that as the expectation, and that we're going to do that moving forward, and learning how to do it. There's a check for accessibility built into all of the Microsoft suite of products. And then you just click it and say, and fix it. And you've already made a huge step towards fixing most of the accessibility issues in PowerPoint or Word. Not 100% of them, but most of them. And your stuff is more accessible than anyone who didn't click that button, right? So you're making a huge step at that point.
Thank you both so much. And, I realize where we're at with time, so I wonder, Troy, Michael, would it be possible if anyone has any further questions to reach out to you afterwards?
Absolutely.
We'd love that.
Thank you both. And Troy and Michael have graciously shared their slides with us. And so afterwards, when we send out continuing education credits to everybody, we'll be sure to share those resources with you all afterwards. And at this time, we would like to provide just our sincerest gratitude and appreciation to Troy Hall and Michael Hanna for this wonderful and meaningful presentation on 10 keys to creating inclusive, accessible, and engaging services for youth. Troy and Michael, we're most grateful for you both taking the time today and sharing your wealth of knowledge and expertise. And of course, for those in attendance, we also appreciate you joining us today. And we would like to invite you to save the date for our next ARCA webinar as part of our month-long June 2024 webinar series, which is actually scheduled for today, Friday, June 14th, 2024, from 12 p.m. Eastern Time to 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time. And that webinar is titled Programmatic and Environmental Accessibility, an overview of expectations and opportunities. For those of you who will be joining us, we will be placing you in the waiting room here on Zoom prior to the upcoming webinar until closer to the top of the hour. As well, please be sure to review our month-long June 2024 webinar series program in the chat box to sign up for our remaining webinars, which will take place every Friday throughout this month. We hope you'll consider joining us. On behalf of the American Rehabilitation Counseling Association, again, thank you so much, Troy and Michael, and we thank you all for joining us, and we wish each of you a wonderful weekend ahead. Thank you.